The story I'd like to tell is the kid from Queens end up in a shelter in October 1973 on Kibbutz Gonen. And we spent 3 weeks in a shelter, either this shelter or a shelter like this during the October 73 war. And conceive of taking a year in Israel, and it started in Durham, North Carolina.
Oh my God.
Started in Durham, North Carolina, because when I was 14 years old, my Uncle Ben invited me down to get out of New York City because he figured he would save my soul by getting me out of New York.
He did.
And he introduced me to the Dworsky family, a group of people who I had never met and my parents had never met, but was a branch of our family. And of course, they are here today. Susan, Avram, and Joyce, who remember way back. I was 14 years old, then 15 years old, then 17 years old, and I stayed with their family, and I became very interested in Judaism in Israel because I had very long conversations with their father, Leon Dworsky, Oliver Sholem, who was the only adult who would spend hours talking to me about Judaism and then invite me into the kitchen at 12 o'clock at night to have ice cream. If you remember, he liked to do that. So fast forward, I go to college, I go to graduate school in Denver, Colorado, get my master's degree at age 22, and unlike everybody else, I had already sold my car, and I rode a bicycle to the Kibbutz Aliyah desk in Denver, where I met the Israeli representative, and I said to him, I just finished my master's program, I want to go to Israel, work on a kibbutz, and learn Hebrew. I want to be in an ulpan because I had been in Israel several years before, and I knew that kibbutzim had ulpanim. And I'll never forget, he said, "You're the first Jew I've met." I said, "What? I'm not even religious." He said, "Doesn't matter. No organization, no pushing. I just walked in and said, I want to volunteer." So I came after my master's, came back to New York, grabbed a backpack. My cousin Avram was already here in Israel. Ironically, in Bnei Brak, he hadn't become a kibbutznik yet. So I connected with Avram, and he was in Bnei Brak in Bar Ilan, if I remember. And I started to work on Kibbutz Bet Oren, where I took an ulpan up in Carmel. After 6 months, along with Chantal, who became my wife, who I knew as Miriam, by the way. I didn't know her French name. She was Miriam, I was Yaakov, and we spoke Pidgin Hebrew. And I heard that it was very good for volunteers here at Kibbutz Gonen from another volunteer. And in that era, if somebody told you it was good to be in a kibbutz somewhere, up in the Hula Valley you went. And I came here, and it was a young kibbutz at that era. Gonen meant the fence. So it was a kibbutz that was built on the old Syrian border. And I was assigned, like all the other volunteers, I spoke a little Hebrew, but I was assigned to, work in the shoveling turkey turd, working in the fish ponds. You kind of rotated, but eventually they settled on making me the gardener, serving with the gardener, and they gave me a little hacksaw, and my nickname on this kibbutz was Katsav, meaning butcher, because once I trimmed any tree, it didn't need to be trimmed anymore, so they tolerated my work, and they wanted us to stay, and we had tickets to leave Israel before, right after, in the middle of October. And we were here on this kibbutz for the October War, but 2 days before the war, they had some volunteers clean out these storage rooms because they were used as storage rooms.
These are
Bunkers.
bomb shelters that were used as storage.
As storage, and we had no idea why would we be taking all the stuff out, but 2 days before the war, people knew something was happening. The war happens on Yom Kippur, and we go into a bomb shelter like this. There were about 50 volunteers on the kibbutz. They divided us up into groups. I don't even remember what we slept on, honestly, but there were like 20 of us in a bomb shelter. Now, the important part of this story was none of us knew what was happening, and we were listening to the BBC inside the shelter to understand what was happening. And we heard the planes coming overhead, the jets coming overhead, but what we were hearing is that the Syrians and the Egyptians had broken through, and that we were in quite a serious situation. Ironically, there were a group of Swiss volunteers who got evacuated. We chose not to get evacuated because we stayed on the kibbutz. We were hoping that we could do some good, but we were told 2 days, actually the first day of the war, the maskir of the kibbutz, a man named David, came in and spoke to me and said nobody should leave the shelter because they expected that Syrian paratroopers would be coming into the Galilee because the Syrians had come within 3 miles, which is extraordinary because it was 15 miles and then in 2 days, 3 miles from where we were in the shelter. And those of us who were Jews understood that whatever fate the Israelis had would be our fate. There were a lot of Gentiles that were here, but we had already had the situation with Uganda, and we knew that Jewish prisoners are divided from Gentile prisoners, and we had no illusions as to what possibly could be.
You hadn't had Uganda yet.
Yeah.
That was 76.
I understand, but we, in Munich. Munich had already happened in 72.
Yes, that's
Correct.
So it was Munich,
Okay, Munich.
thank you.
Okay.
It was Munich that happened, and so we were in a situation. What I want to say is that what was very important is that we had a feeling of shared destiny with the people here. And when the war started, the men who had been on this kibbutz, nobody knew, or I didn't know, what role they had. They would start to leave, and they would be in uniforms. And eventually, it was only the women, children, volunteers, maybe a couple of men, who remained on this kibbutz throughout the war. And for 2 days, we never left the shelter. There was a ceasefire and then a second ceasefire. When the first ceasefire happened, I called my mother in New York, and she said what any Jewish mother would say, 2 words, come home. I said, how can I leave? It's a war, right? How can I leave? We decided to stay, and we stayed through the end, and we deferred our ticket. And I remember that the head of the gardening person, a woman named Hannah, said to me, you must have a Jewish soul. And I said, well, there are a lot of Gentiles who are still here. In my mind, it wasn't that. But I'm connecting what that person in Denver said to what this person said, is that they recognized that we were here not to have fun, but we were here to be with Israelis. We came back to New York after being here, but that war was an indelible part of my life. And the part of the story that I want to share, which is very difficult, is that we were in this shelter, and the women of the kibbutz cooked and brought the food to us. Their husbands were at war. Their children were in the garden, the nursery. And we were protected, and these women came up the hill and fed 50 volunteers. I didn't appreciate it at the time.
At what point did you realize that the Israelis were really winning the war and not what?
Probably once the reserves came. Remember, it took 2 days to mobilize, and by the way, thank you for that question. 2 days, 3 days in, droves of trucks were going up, and the soldiers would come down to the Chadar HaOchel. There was a small Chadar HaOchel, and the kibbutz became a base, and we would sit and see the soldiers coming in, and then they would go up. By the way, they were our age, and I was in a shelter, and they were fighting on the hill. So when I think of those kids fighting, and I think about the women bringing us our food at the risk of their own lives, it made an indelible impression on me. And when people ask me, why am I so involved with Israel, I will never forget. what happened here. And I thank you for being with me. This was an important part of our lives. And whenever I came back, I always thought about what we experienced here on Kibbutz Gonen, which was a wonderful place to be, by the way. I mean, it's a beautiful part of the country, young kibbutz. The volunteers were from all over the world. And I remember writing a blog post about this in 2006 when I did come back and visit. And I posted that blog post, and people from all over the world would write and say, you know, that was the best time of my life when I was a volunteer at Kibbutz Gonen, no matter what year it was. So that's the story that I wanted to tell. And when you look at a place like this, that is, it almost looks ancient. It almost looks like it's part of the archaeology. There are many stories that go along with the people who were in these shelters during that time. And that's what I wanted to tell you.
Thank you for sharing.